Hey, welcome to my channel, Beginning Christian. So today's video is going to be archaeology for the Bible, right? So in this video, I'm going to share 10 archaeological finds for the Bible, in particular, the Gospels of the New Testament. After that, I'm going to offer an answer for a common argument that historians and archaeologists use to imply that the Gospel writers were wrong, right? Some of these people, along with critics of the Bible, say that the Gospel writers took real people, real locations, real historic events, and fashioned a story around them, right? They won't deny the existence of Jesus, but they'll deny the truth of his story, right? His healings, his miracles, his journey, and his association with historical figures such as Herod and Pontius Pilate. They reduce it to the status of a story like the Odyssey or Hercules, right? If these writers intend this to be taken historically, and we find that there is historical support for it, then this is just one piece of a larger case for the reliability of the Gospels. So this journey is the journey to provide and prove historical context for what the writers of the Gospel have written. So Luke prefaces his Gospel with his historical methodology, and this shows that his intention is to give you an actual historical account. John essentially signs the testimony near the end of his Gospel to say, I was there. This is true according to my word. What are they doing? They're attempting to give us a narrative with eyewitness accounts of what happened rather than just telling a story to communicate some kind of theological truth or moral idea. The finds I'm going to discuss aren't going to be earth-shattering for most people. They probably won't be earth-shattering for anybody. They will be a little less known and a little less discussed, but they will be helpful in establishing another side of the historical accuracy of the Gospels. Number one. So let's get started. Number one, coins bearing the image of Herod. So the Herodian dynasty pops up from time to time in the Gospels and the book of Acts. So who is the Herod family? The Gospel writers present them, name them, and situate them in specific geographical areas and political arenas. They're even given titles. So Luke 3:1. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. Here, among other political leaders, Luke names two members of the Herod family. Matthew 2:1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Again, mention of Herod in a high political position, a position of power no less, right? He's a very well-known figure. I don't think anyone's going to argue against his historical significance or existence. He's presented as a king with the title of king. And this is verified by Josephus, who is a renowned Jewish historian. And there are some very interesting things on Herod's coins, right? First, he calls himself King Herod on the coins, right? He has the title of king as stated in the Gospels. It's not governor or some other title, it is king. And we know from Josephus that the Roman Empire allowed him to have that title, right? Judea at the time of Herod the Great was a client kingdom instead of a province, and provinces were typically ruled by a Roman governor. Another interesting engraving on Herod's coin is a helmet with a star on it. It seems to be a Roman pagan symbol, but it can also be a messianic interpretation. Whatever it is, he's very bold to put something like that on there. Now, if it's intended to be pagan, it's very bold because he's supposed to be practicing Judaism. He's a Jew. But at the same time, he thinks of himself very highly. He's the king, right? He's the guy who has to be there, and he doesn't want anyone else to take his position, right? He's portrayed as very paranoid in the Gospels, very protective of his kingdom, right? He's also not the most liked king because he ordered the death of all males under the age of 2 in Jerusalem when Jesus was born. And there are quite a few of these coins, and they've been slowly unearthed over the years. And as I stated before, there were also other Herodians in the history books, right? The second Herodian is Archelaus, one of Herod's sons. Matthew 2:2. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. So that's a pretty good historical detail that Matthew includes in his narrative, right? It's not a huge deal. Herod dies, and in his will, he gives his kingdom to his sons, and they split it up. So Archelaus ends up ruling Judea and Samaria, and he has his title ethnarch, which means ruler of the people. He's elevated higher, and that's the impression we get from the Gospels, right? He's the semi-heir of Herod, even though the kingdom is split and he only gets 2 regions. What he does get is a different title, and on his coins we have his family name, Herod, and this title, ethnarch. And this is archaeological attestation of Archelaus and his title and his place as the king of Judea. There are also coins that identify and support the existence of Herod Antipas and Philip, right? We now have a lot of information on Herod Antipas due to recent excavations in Galilee, where he used to be the ruler, right? The city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee was his new capital. And so many of the coins found in this area have his name and title on them in Greek, Herod the Tetrarch. And this is the title he went by, not so much Herod Antipas, although we do read that name in the Gospels. They use these titles to distinguish themselves from each other in the Gospels, and it fits with the way that they show themselves on their coins. The Gospel writers have included these 4 Herods in their writings, and we have found coins over the years that match the time, place, and titles of each one of these rulers. Something more interesting lies in the story of John the Baptizer. Salome was the stepdaughter of Herod the Tetrarch, and she requested that John be beheaded as a result of dancing at Herod's birthday feast. Later on, she would marry into another wealthy family in that area and would have her face and name, Queen Salome, imprinted on a coin of her own. So she's another connection to the family of Herod. Number 2, the Lysanias inscriptions. So Lysanias is another name mentioned in Luke 3:1. What Luke is doing with all these names is listing the different regional rulers to set up the context for the ministry of Jesus. So this is Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene. Abilene was the capital of the region, right? Lysanias is a little more problematic than the Herods because allegedly he wasn't supposed to be ruling in that area at the time of the ministry of Jesus. Many scholars look at this and say that there's some kind of chronological error made by Luke, right? We know about a Lysanias who ruled earlier in that area, but around 28 AD or so, they're saying he shouldn't be there, right? So Josephus talks about this family of rulers based out of Abila, and there's an earlier guy named Lysanias, and so the scholars propose that Luke mix things up. He was a much earlier ruler who either wasn't alive or wasn't in power at the time of Jesus. However, there are descendants of this earlier guy who were ruling at the time of Luke, and one of them had the name of Lysanias, right? The way we know this is through an archaeological discovery of Greek inscriptions in the city of Abila. The inscriptions state many things that Lysanias had done throughout the city during the time of Emperor Tiberius. More importantly, they appear just before Tiberius's wife, Livia Drusilla, dies, and she dies around 29 AD. These inscriptions tell us that there was a Lysanias ruling in Abila at the time of Jesus' ministry, and he was called Lysanias the Tetrarch, as Luke writes. And Luke drops so many names, so many places, and so much detail, right? He goes out of his way to place Jesus' ministry at its correct time in history. And as we find and corroborate these names, places, and times in history, it gives us much more credibility to Luke's accuracy, right? He gives us a time, a place, a short social, cultural history so that people can check his references and know that it's historically accurate. So number 3, Nazareth. Nazareth used to be a problem for some scholars. Nazareth and the Gospels, because archaeologically, we really didn't see anything showing up in the first century that demonstrated it was a village occupied by Jews who observed the Mosaic law. And this is how Nazareth is depicted in the Gospels. So as excavations have progressed in the area, people have found material in Nazareth, such as pottery and coins from the first century. They found a number of things that demonstrate the correctness of the Gospels concerning our first century impressions of Nazareth during the time of Jesus' ministry, right? We have a first century village in Galilee named Nazareth. It's these first century ideas dated by pottery, coins, specific types of stone vessels, architectural styles in tombs and structures. Beyond that, they have found many stone vessels that were used in ritual washings in the Mosaic Law. They were used for purification. They have also found specific types of tombs used by Jews during the Roman occupation, like rock-cut, stone-sealed tombs. And we know that first century Nazareth was occupied by Jews who observed the Mosaic Law. And this is what the Gospels tell us. So 4, Herod's temple. John 2:20. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So this is both archaeological and literary, right? Now, the temple Jesus is referring to is his body, but the Jews around him are confused because it took 46 years to build the temple that Jesus is looking at when he makes that statement. And the temple that they are referring to, of course, is the one that Herod the Great rebuilt. According to Josephus and inscriptions unearthed from other archaeological excavations, the reconstruction of the temple began in 19 BC. Add 46 years to that, and it dates this interaction between Jesus and these Jews in either late 27 or 28 AD. And that's really important as a chronological anchor for the gospel, especially for the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. We don't have much information regarding the beginning of his ministry. Basically, we have this passage and then Luke 3:1 that give us some specifics on when Jesus started his ministry. That passage comes just after Jesus' baptism and the wedding at Canaan, right? We know it's right there at the beginning of his ministry. Of course, we could also talk about the reconstruction of the temple and archaeological finds that relate to that. Foundational stones from the temple have been unearthed almost 2,000 years after its destruction in 70 AD, and they attest to its existence, right? This is also hopeful for chronological context and setting. Now, if we compare this to Luke 3:1, where he says the ministry of Jesus started in the 15th year of Tiberius, there's also a chronological confirmation. Tiberius's first year of sole leadership was in 14 AD. So his 15th year would have begun in 28 AD. And these two connect together, and they use both archaeological and historical evidence outside of the gospel to verify this. The Gospels of Luke and John align with these external sources and match up to about 28 AD. The Gadara tombs. So Gadara, or the land of the Gadarens, is mentioned in the famous story of Jesus exorcising the demoniac and casting them into the swine, whereby the swine throw themselves into the Sea of Galilee and drown. If you want to read the story, it's Luke 8:26 through 39. And the passage is clearly talking about the land of Gadara and its people. It was one of the Decapolis cities on the southeastern side of the Sea of Galilee. The archaeological site today is called Case, right? And there has been a lot of excavation. There's been a lot of excavation there, but what's interesting in relation to this story is that it talks about the demoniac living in a tomb, being chained up, and even being guarded. So what's up with this, right? This demoniac is from the city, now living in a tomb, chained to something to keep him from hurting himself or anyone else, and guarded. So if you go to this area today, located between the city and the Sea of Galilee, you will find some tombs, right? They are extremely elaborate and impressive rock-cut tombs. They almost represent houses with doors, and there are stone pillars in some of the rooms that the demoniac could have possibly been chained to, right? He could have been living there as though it was his house, located very far from the city. Occasionally, he would escape his chains and run away, and this is when he encounters Jesus. The connection point here, if I wasn't completely clear, is that this physical location of the tombs corresponds with the location given in the accounts by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So number 6, the pool of Bethesda. So John 5:2. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. So the pool of Bethesda is on the northern side of Jerusalem, and it is something that was more or less lost to history after the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD. All right, people had a general idea of where it was, but not exactly what it looked like. In the 4th century, there seems to be some knowledge of it, but John talks about 5 colonnades, right? A colonnade is a structure consisting of a roof supported by columns at regular intervals. So scholars have always wondered what this structure really looks like, right? What is the shape of this pool? This pool that has 5 sides, or at least is surrounded by 5 sets of colonnades. So when it was excavated, they discovered that it was 4-sided, with the 5th colonnade running through the middle that separated the pool into an upper and lower pool, right? So this is in line with the description John gives in verse 2, right? He also mentions a sheep gate, and we believe from ancient historical documents that there were other pools specifically designed to wash sheep, right? We find the pool mentioned in Antiquities of the Jews, which is an attested historical account by Josephus, or in the Copper Scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know from an archaeological standpoint about the true existence of the Pool of Bethesda. We're given elements of the name, its usage, and its architectural design that agree with John's description. However, there's more to the story due to the Emperor Hadrian around 129 AD. So he goes to Jerusalem with the intention of rebuilding the city and establishing a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina. In doing so, he builds all these Roman temples and shrines over locations associated with the ministry of Jesus, right? He did it down in Bethlehem at the site of Jesus' birthplace. He built over the tomb of Jesus, and possibly Golgotha, the site of the crucifixion. And the pool of Siloam, and he did it over the pool of Bethesda. So he did it over 2 pools, right? He built a temple or a shrine to the Greek Roman god Asclepius, the god of healing, over the pool, right? And when they excavated the site, they found remnants of the temple as well as offerings to Asclepius, including this marble foot, right? This foot had a dedicatory inscription on it thanking this god for the healing of someone. As part of the ritual, people would take whatever body part was healed, cast a likeness of it in wood, stone, marble, whatever they could afford, and offer it to this god. Unfortunately, many of the colonnades have been destroyed due to construction and deconstruction in later periods. You can still see sections of the upper and lower pool as well as the steps that lead into the lower pool. 7, the trumpeting inscription. This is a fairly recent find and was discovered when archaeologists were excavating through material on the southwestern side of the Temple Mount, right? The material is rubble from the temple and the structures that surrounded it after its destruction in 70 AD. The Romans dismantled the temple to get to the gold out as it was burning by pushing the rubble off of the foundation onto the side of the mount. It's a Hebrew inscription on stone, partially broken, that says, "For the place of trumpeting to declare." And we believe that this was a stone set up at some high point, maybe a tower on a corner of the Temple Mount, and it was a designated place to use a trumpet to announce something, right? I know that sounds vague, but Josephus writes about how priests would blow a trumpet from a high point of the temple to announce events such as the beginning and ending of Sabbath, as well as other important things. It was like a bell tower, but for very specific events. And this is connected to the Gospels through Peter's denial of Jesus. So John 13:37 through 38. Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." So in the Greek, the word for rooster is elector. Now, elector does mean rooster. However, in ancient Greek, it was also used to indicate a trumpeter. So in certain contexts, it could mean trumpeter, right? Some Bible scholars believe that Jesus is referencing the trumpeter who would sound off the beginning of Sabbath. And that is what Peter would hear once he denied Jesus 3 times, right? So when we think about it, this makes more sense than a rooster crowing, right? Roosters weren't allowed in the city of Jerusalem. Livestock wasn't allowed in the city unless kept specifically for the sacrificial system. Now, there can be arguments for and against this, obviously, but I believe Jesus was referencing the trumpeting at the beginning of Sabbath because this was around the time he was arrested and suffering through his many unsanctioned trials. We also read about this in Josephus, who is backed by the inscription on this piece of temple stone, or which is backed by the inscription on this piece of temple stone. So number 8, the Theodotus inscription. So this was found in Jerusalem inside a cistern where they would collect and store water in the neighborhood of Siloam. And Siloam is referenced in John chapter 9. And I hope I'm saying that correctly. Sometimes I don't pronounce these Greek and Hebrew words correctly, so forgive me if I get it wrong. So John 9, 6 or 7. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. This inscription discusses the construction of a synagogue, a hospice, or a guest house, right? It's a Greek inscription with 10 lines of text that gives the name of Theodotus, right? It also talks about a synagogue ruler, an earlier synagogue, the reading of the law, the teaching of the commandments, and other such activities. It confirms that there was a synagogue in this neighborhood of Jerusalem. It had been there for a while, and they built a new one to replace the earlier synagogue, and it tells us that there was a leader of this synagogue. Well, this is in the area of Siloam, right? When we look at the Gospels, we find synagogues mentioned in a lot of different places, right? This isn't so much an issue today, but not too long ago, some scholars had issues with the Gospels saying that first century Judea and Galilee were surrounded with synagogues because there simply wasn't enough archaeological evidence to support it. Now, many have been found and others are currently being excavated. However, this is the only true evidence we have to prove that first century synagogues existed in Jerusalem. Of course, it's not remains of a building, a structure, or anything else physical. It's an inscription. And in some ways, it's much stronger because you can't refute the inscription like you can a piece of stone or some other piece of architecture. So 9, the Simon of Cyrene ossuary. So Simon is famous for carrying Jesus' cross after he fell, right? The Gospel of Mark gives us great detail concerning Simon. Mark 15:21. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. So 2 ossuaries, which are funeral boxes that contain bones of the dead, were found in the Kidron Valley. And this is the valley on the east side of Jerusalem where there are a lot of tombs and burials, right? These 2 ossuaries have inscriptions on them that mention Simon of Cyrene. What's written on the first one is Alexander, son of Simon, along with the designation of Cyrenian. If we compare this with Mark's information in the Gospels, it matches up. The other ossuary has the name of one of his daughters. Now, she's not mentioned in the Gospels, right? She's from the city of Ptolemais, which is one of the 5 main cities in Cyrene. The geographic context is there, along with specific familial relationships with these names. And there weren't many people from Cyrene in Jerusalem at that time in the first century. So that does narrow it down to a very small amount of people. Can we say 100%? No, but it's very plausible. So 10, and I struggle with this one, Alexamenos graffito. And the reason why I struggle is because in doing research, you find that different people who have done different research pronounce all these words differently, right? They pronounce all these Greek and Hebrew words differently. So when I do my research, I'm not sure what the correct pronunciation is. Maybe if I took Greek or Hebrew, I could nail it. But really, when I pronounce these words, I'm going off pronunciations that I've heard from other people. So, Alexamenos graffito. So there are some etchings on a wall inside a building on the Palatine Hill in Rome. And tradition holds that Romulus and Remus founded the original city of Rome on the Palatine Hill in 753 BC. It's one of the most ancient parts of the city. And this is very far away from Jerusalem, right? It's dated between 100 AD and 200 AD. So it's not too long after the death of Jesus, right? It's 100 AD. Christianity is on the rise, and New Testament books were recently finished. Do people know much about Jesus in Rome, right? The etching is a picture with text on it, right? It's a picture that shows Jesus on a cross with the head of a donkey and a guy named in the inscription at the foot of the cross. And the inscription says, Alexamenos worships his God. So clearly someone is mocking poor Alexamenos. They're even mocking Jesus, right? Whoever has written this is mocking God and Alexamenos. So at the very least, it's an insult to Jesus, right? It might even be related to the triumphal entry where Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. So they're mocking Jesus and the crucifixion, but they also know about Jesus and the crucifixion. They know that the Christians worship this crucified Jesus as God, and they put that in the inscription. And Paul addresses this very issue in Corinthians, right? 1 Corinthians 1 through 23. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. So the Romans clearly thought it was foolish that a God would ride a donkey during a triumphal entry and endure crucifixion, right? Crucifixion was generally reserved for non-Roman criminals. And it was meant to be humiliating. In the New Testament, Jesus' death on the cross and his removal from the cross is very swift because of Sabbath, right? The Pharisees don't want Jesus' body up there for 3 days because it will stain the Sabbath, right? But generally, in the Roman Empire, the Romans would leave the bodies of the crucified on the crosses for days, as an example, right? Jesus was taken down. Jesus and the thieves were taken down very quickly because the crucifixion happened during Sabbath. But in Rome, when non-Romans were crucified, they would stay there for days. So people could walk by and they would see your dead body just hanging on this cross, decomposing, and it was very humiliating, right? So what God would suffer this humiliation, right? People know about Jesus, they know about the crucifixion, they know his followers worship him, and they seem to know details about the triumphal entry. And once again, this is in Rome. Now, we do know that Paul wrote letters to the Romans and that he spent a total of 4 years in Rome, right? He spent 2 years in prison in Caesarea and then another 2 years in Rome under house arrest. So it's possible that Alexamenos was exposed to it. We also know that in the letter of Romans, Paul wrote to the Romans because he knew that somehow the Gospels, before they were the Gospels, he knew that somehow word of Jesus Christ had reached Rome, but it wasn't him, right? He knew it wasn't him. He knew it wasn't any other apostles. He just knew that somehow some Romans knew about Jesus Christ. They just couldn't nail down how they knew. So it's possible that Alexamenos was among those Romans who had been introduced to the gospel. What historians who believe in the Bible, what they believe is that a Roman had gone to Jerusalem or had gone to one of these areas where Jesus was preaching his ministry, and they took back his teachings to Rome and began to teach in Rome, but nobody knows who it was. So it's possible Alexamenos found this person. So I like these obscure facts that most people don't know, because collectively they make a very good case against the fact that some people believe that the apostles just made this story up, right? You can't hear these incidental details and believe they were crafted or invented to deceive us, right? They have some pretty convincing archaeological evidence. And a common objection that I've heard at many times is that the Bible depiction of Pontius Pilate is different from his depiction in secular works like Philo and Josephus, right? In the Bible, he seems to bend or concede to the will of the Jews, right? And we know that the Romans hated the Jews, right? Whereas in the secular works, he's often depicted as a strong, tyrannical ruler, right? Here, he doesn't seem to be a ruler who would care about the plight of the Jews. As a matter of fact, he did many, many things to, he did many, many bad things about the Jews. He did many, many bad things to the Jews. Like he would parade through the temple with statues of Roman gods and place them all around the temple. Or he would sacrifice Jews and mix their blood with the blood of other people who had been sacrificed, which the Jews didn't like, right? So he just doesn't seem to be like, he doesn't seem to be a person who'd be like, okay, you win, I'll crucify this guy who just doesn't seem to be a criminal. However, in Josephus and Philo, we read that men in Pilate's political position were often in trouble for their behavior, right? We have 4 to 5 examples where complaints were brought against Pilate by the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was the ruling governmental party. Pilate did, like I said before, Pilate did many things to agitate and aggravate the Jews, and they would file complaints with the emperor. The Gospel of Luke contains one verse where some Jews tell Jesus about several Galileans who were killed by Pilate, and their blood was mixed with the blood of their sacrifices, right? So Pilate was eventually removed from his position and recalled to Rome to answer for these complaints, right? He might have been punished for this with a possible death sentence, but the Emperor Tiberius died before he could reach Rome, so he was saved, right? But his removal would happen in 36 AD. So maybe, just maybe, in 33 AD, he knows he's in trouble, so he doesn't want to make any waves with the Jews, right? He doesn't want to execute Jesus, but he doesn't want to stir up any more trouble. So John 19:12, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. So this is political terminology used as a direct threat against Pilate, and Pilate recognizes it, right? And there's even more to the story than this. Pilate is appointed as the prefect of Judea in 26 AD. During this time, there were some interesting things happening in Rome. A Roman soldier named Lucius alias Sejanus, who was a friend and confidant of Emperor Tiberius, and consequently rose to the position of prefect to the Praetorian Guard, gained a huge amount of power by 23 AD. He was so powerful and influential that in 26 AD, when Tiberius decided to retire to the island of Capri, Sejanus basically ran the empire. Now in 31 AD, Tiberius learned of a plot by Sejanus to kill Tiberius's son, and Sejanus had him assassinated. So he then also killed many of his political supporters, family members, and friends in the following days. So if you were connected to Sejanus in any way during this time, your life was potentially in peril. So this connects to Pilate because he was appointed as governor in 26 AD. So it's possible he was a supporter of Sejanus and appointed by him. Now this is completely conjecture, right? We don't have any historical evidence to prove this, but it's interesting and fun, right? So if it's the truth, then he's walking on eggshells when the trial of Jesus comes to his palace, right? And this is only a year and a half after the assassination of Sejanus and everyone involved with him. So it's fresh in Pilate's mind, right? Back in those days, a year and a half was, for us today, a year and a half is a long time, but back then, a year and a half was not a long time because it took so long to get everywhere. And it took so long to get mail to all the regions of Rome, right? And Rome was vast. So a year and a half, your buddy Sejanus dies, right? They kill his sons, his daughters, his wife, his brothers, sisters, so on and so forth. You're still thinking, oh my gosh, he could still come for me where I am. So, so all that being said, he might not want to put himself in a worse position with Tiberius. And it's very possible that by 33 AD, Pilate had a very different mindset and was more worried about his own mortality versus the mortality of this lowly Jewish carpenter from Nazareth. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope you find it mildly useful. And thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. Have a blessed day and happy Easter.